During 1984, in Geneva, Switzerland, a cult came to fruition. Founding members consisted of Joseph de Mambro, a Swiss man who studied clockmaking and goldsmithing, alongside Belgian medical professional Luc Jouret, who had a greater interest in the supernatural and occult. In January of 1956, Joseph had joined the ancient mystical order of the Rosicrucis, or Amorc for short. In the late 1960s, Joseph had later become the head of the Amorc Lodge in Nimes, France. He remained a Rosicrucian member until 1969, where he subsequently abandoned his career in jewelry to become a full-time lecturer during the New Age movement. The New Age movement, for those that don't know, was the revival and creation of various spiritualist and occult metaphysical groups in the 1970s and 80s. The hope was to replace present-day society with a new golden age of sorts. During the 90s, this pursuit for a hypothetical and ultimately futile utopia crumbled. What remains are scarce traces of a time long since past in the form of residual cults and a reconstructed self-proclaimed psychic community. As for what Joseph did during this time, he had founded the Center for the Preparation of the New Age in Annemasse, France. Bit of a mouthful. 3 years later, in 1976, a communal group had been established in Geneva, Switzerland, the Golden Foundation, which 2 years later was superseded by La Pyramide. During his time in Geneva, de Mambro had begun presenting himself as a representative of the Great White Brotherhood, a group of evolved beings which some theosophists see as guides of human evolution. Joseph had claimed to have been the reincarnation of several ancient figures, such as Moses and Amenhotep IV. As for Luc Jouret, he went on his own spiritual journey through the Philippines, China, Peru, and India before eventually making Annemasse his home, relatively close to the Swiss border. During his time in France, he practiced homeopathy, a pseudoscientific alternative medicine where the belief is the substances that cause symptoms of a disease in a healthy person can cure similar symptoms in a sick person. Jouret would routinely conduct lectures on holistic health and the paranormal. He took to lecturing anyone who responded to him. Among the groups who attended was the Golden Way Foundation. There, Luc met and later befriended the founder, the aforementioned Joseph de Mambro. Soon they came together to form the Order of the Solar Temple. Luc Jouret formed a private club where those that joined would be individually selected and indoctrinated into the Solar Temple. With the order growing, Joseph assigned mates to the members, looking for partners to birth perfect children who would assist Joseph's daughter, who he referred to as the Cosmic Child, in their collective ascension. The beliefs and principles have been documented by Temple member Robert Gebray in his book Why a Revival of the Solar Temple, Volume 1, The Body. The goals included, from pages 147 to 149, establishing correct notions of authority and power in the world, an affirmation of the primacy of the spiritual over the temporal, essentially declare that the spirit or otherworldly is more valuable than the worldly and physical, assisting humanity through a great transition period, preparing for the second coming of Christ as a solar god king, and furthering a unification of all Christian churches and Islam. Additionally, the cult supposedly found inspiration for its teachings through the works of Aleister Crowley, an English occultist who is considered by many as a highly influential figure in the circle of Western esotericism and counterculture. Like most cults, the Solar Temple was built on the concepts of money, sex, and unquestioned power, all while being ruled by your typical synarchist leader. Further temple lodges had been constructed in Quebec, Australia, Switzerland, and the island of Martinique. The remains of the headquarters can still be found in Switzerland today, though only the foundation remains. As for their activities, they were a mixture of early Christian identity, UFO religion, and New Age philosophy, while also employing adaptations of various previously known Freemason rituals, and the works of English esoteric writer Alice Bailey. They were performed in hopes to call upon the Great White Brotherhood to release a form of energy throughout the world that would bring the awaited change. Whatever that would have looked like is up for debate and interpretation. Due to the similarities, the Order of the Solar Temple had been likened to a similar group where 39 members had all taken their lives, the infamous Heaven's Gate. And like Heaven's Gate, Joseph de Mambro brainwashed his followers. De Mambro did so in an attempt to solidify the idea that he was a member of the 14th century Knights Templar, in a previous life that is. and that his daughter was this so-called cosmic child. Joseph had claimed that he and his followers would leave Earth and be led to a planet orbiting the star Sirius after they died. Though, that isn't to say they all went peacefully. Any of them, for that matter. All seemed to be going well for the cult. Well enough, that is. Though, by the early 90s, things took a turn for the worse. The cult's leader, Demambro, and many others. Demambro's waning grasp on his followers had reached its apex. The slow collapse of the order had begun. In 1991, a member of the cult, Swiss composer and conductor Michael Buchny, used the right to be forgotten to erase any ties he had with the Solar Temple. He wasn't without scrutiny himself. After the cult deteriorated, he was accused of having been involved in the nefarious crimes, which we'll be getting into shortly. He then testified against the cult for the killing of several unnamed children. However, this was only the beginning of a sharp decline in both the temple's stability and their morals. Over the following years, problem and misfortune struck the organization. In 1993, during luxurious travels, he had made an effort to acquire various illegal firearms. Unsurprisingly, he had been caught and arrested by local authorities. This blunder had both shattered Jarre's reputation, as well as having brought unwanted eyes onto the Solar Temple. The issues hadn't reached their end. Following this incident, Demambro's health had sharply declined. His kidneys experienced some degree of failure, his bodily functions became involuntary, and he had developed a form of cancer. As a cherry to top off his malignant cake, the cosmic child revolted against her father. The treatment she had been enduring had broken her, leaving her as a thorn in his failing sides. The complications set the stage for the next act in Demambro's miserable story. Feeling as though the general public were not responding to the new age as he envisioned, he felt as though it was time for the cult to release their horror unto the world. Remember when I mentioned that Demambro had claimed to be the incarnation of ancient figures of religious importance? Because of this belief, he took criticism poorly. Openly claiming to be Jesus Christ led to expected disbelief among members of the temple. However, one member in particular, Tony the Toy, had the courage to speak up on the matter after watching the hypocrisy of the wannabe religious deity unfurl. Demambro would use this claim to sleep with one of the brainwashed female members before every ritual, stating it gave him strength for the upcoming ceremony. With the words off Tony's chest, he promptly left the group of fanatics. This wasn't without consequences, of course, it never is. He had returned to his wife and child in Canada without any confrontation on the way out of the temple. This was, sadly, short-lived. Like a puppeteer, Demambro sent his sycophants to Tony's home. Joseph had identified Tony's son as the Antichrist, clearly to silence him, and that the organization's goals could not be carried out without his death. During October of 1994, Tony, his wife, and 3-month-old son had been murdered. The horror begins with the boy's death. He had been repeatedly stabbed with a wooden stake and wrapped in a black plastic bag. The stake had been left embedded in his chest for police to find. This was the first instance in a string of murders that would ensue, lasting until March 23, 1997. Nearly 3 years of atrocities. What followed was nothing short of a nightmare. After an undisclosed amount of time, Demambro and 12 of his followers conducted a ritual, specifically a replication of the Last Supper. Instead of a crucifixion preceding the meal, a mass suicide was conducted in 2 Swiss villages, Chiry and Salvan, as well as Morin Heights, Quebec. The participants ended their lives through various means: poison, firearms, smothering, and other less detailed alternatives. In Switzerland, many of those who took their lives are located in an underground chapel, lined with mirrors and various other paraphernalia relating to Templar symbolism. The cultists have worn their robes at the time of death and were organized in a circular pattern, their feet together and their heads outward, fittingly like illustrations of the sun. All of those in the circle had a plastic bag over their heads, each one with a bullet hole to accompany it. The exact meaning, if any, for the plastic bags remains a mystery. As for the victims themselves, through autopsy, many of them were found to have been drugged prior to the ordeal. Outside of the chapel, more zealots carried out their deeds. More victims were found in 3 separate ski chalets. Among them were several deceased children. These horrors were discovered when officials had made their way to assist in fighting the fires that broke out. Officers later found there to be remote-controlled devices at each location, which were likely the causes of the fires. Both DeMambro and Jouret were found to have perished within the first wave of suicides, DeMambro in the chapel and Jouret at one of Salvin's chalets. Farewell letters were collected from the now deceased believers. In these notes were ramblings and nonsense that you would expect from deranged doomsday cultists, looking to escape what they believed to be the inevitable, to rid themselves of the hypocrisies and oppressions of this world. Sifting through the dead in Switzerland, an alarming discovery was made. A mayor, journalist, civil servant, and a sales manager were identified. The Quebec police had disclosed financial information pertaining to some of the members of the cult. Some had donated upwards of $1 million Canadian to DeMambro, hinting at several wealthy individuals being involved. Another mass killing and/or suicide related to the Solar Temple had taken place during the nights of December 15th and 16th. It wasn't until December 23rd, 1995, that 16 bodies were discovered in Vercors Mountains of France. The corpses had been left in a star-like formation with a likeness to that of the chapel suicides. Each attendee had been shot, following with the 2 gunners' own suicides. Not only were guns used at the scene, but there was also evidence of immolation, burned bodies and charred terrain being the most apparent clues. One of the deceased had been French alpine Olympic skier Edith Bonlou, another figure of notice. Perhaps the cult's reach had been much greater than the outcome may suggest. All was predominantly quiet, to the public's knowledge that is, for the next year and a half. This tragically didn't last. March 23rd, 1997. 5 temple cultists had immolated themselves in a house fire in Saint Casimir, Quebec. A shed had been located on the property. Inside were 3 teenagers, ages 13, 14, and 16. They were alive, albeit heavily drugged. Fortunately, the Spanish sect only saw 1 death in Spain in 1998. There was, however, talk of a potential plot for a ritual suicide akin to the ones that occurred elsewhere. This was quickly thwarted by Spanish and German police officers. Of the several documented incidents, 74 murder-suicides have been accounted for, including the founders of the temple, of course. Despite the fall of key internal figures, the cult remains active today, holding anywhere between 140 to 500 members as of the time of writing, though this number appears to be speculation at best.